I grew up like many young boys playing baseball. It all started for me in the Coweta Youth Baseball League. That's where I fell in love with the game. I remember a guy named Les Punches coming over to my house, inviting me to play on his team because his son and I were the same age. I remember there being about 4 teams in our city league, and the pattern was for us to play those other 3 teams about 3 or 4 times during the season. You know, when I think about that season of my life was one of my favorites because I got to compete against kids who would later become my teammates. About every 2 or 3 years, the team would fold up and the remaining players would be put onto one of the other teams. And that pattern continued on, and that cycle of life happens in many youth sports throughout the country. But after my 8th grade year, I remember that very clearly what was going on at that point. But we had one more chance to play ball with the guys who were there from the very beginning. The boys that were on that team were guys that wanted one last shot of playing together with the same guys at the same age before a few of us went up to play high school ball where there were 3 or 4 years combined. I look back at that summer and I remember it well, and it was definitely not because of the style of play that was on the field, because it wasn't all that pretty kind of baseball. Why? Because we brought back some guys that hadn't played in a long time, but they just wanted to be together again. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't a pretty memory, but it was great because of who was playing. It was great because of not the performance, but because of the people. You know, that's what it should be all about. It's not the performance, but it's the people that are together that is putting it together, make sense of it all. You know, there are middle-aged men playing this game that I love, making millions and millions of dollars doing it. And most of the time, they're only doing it for a paycheck. You know, the game, to me, is most pure when it's played out on a youth field like this. Kids who love the game. But we become so fascinated by all the fancy lights, the upper decks, the souvenirs, and the multi-year contracts. You know, it's the same in a lot of ways in the church. You know, we worship in nice auditoriums, you know, with quality sound systems, large video screens, sitting in comfortable chairs, pointed at a stage with a speaker who's been paid to talk to us in the most clear voice possible. And so we know what they're talking about. Is this really what it's supposed to be all about? I can't help but thinking about the early church and how Jesus was laying the foundations for it. And is what we are doing today what he intended it to be? It wasn't meant to be about the place, it was meant to be about the people. Jesus didn't begin his ministry by acquiring land and raising up funds at a central location and expecting people to come and see him. It wasn't in his plans to hire a dynamic harp player to lead worship or to find the most creative marketplace entertainer to do youth ministry. That's not what it was about. Jesus looked for regular people to be a part of something bigger than themselves. He went to a couple of sets of brothers that were working honest jobs as fishermen, and he said to them, "Hey, why don't you take that skill of fishing and come work with me? Why don't if you follow me, you'll make a much better impact on the world than what you're doing right now. You won't just be sitting in a boat, you'll be saving human lives instead of catching fish and selling them." He approached a crooked tax collector and who sold out to the Roman government at that time and betrayed his own people by taking more of their money than he probably should have. Jesus challenged Matthew to join forces to a much greater kingdom than the one he was working for, to make a more lasting impact in people's lives, to influence them in a positive way rather than what he was doing. And he calls carpenters and janitors and nurses and trash men. He asks teachers and waitresses and dancers to follow him. Jesus asked for people that we wouldn't expect. He didn't just go to the showcase tournaments to scout out the talent. He sits in the stands and he looks for people, looking for regular people who love the game, who love what it's all about. You know, the story of God has always been cast with regular people. Abraham wasn't a man that had a family legacy to lean on, when God called on him. It wasn't about that. Abraham was a nomad going from one place to the other, looking, with no descendants to carry on his family name before God called on him as a regular man. Moses was adopted into a tyrant's family. He was adopted to live with a tyrant, and he got kicked out of the place whenever he called someone out and he killed an official. And if we're going to speak about murderers, we think about David. David wasn't exactly the most picture-perfect holiness of a man. David was a meek shepherd in the beginning, living in the shadow of a king that was much bigger and broader in stature than David would have ever been. David was a regular guy. But God wasn't about shapes and sizes. It was about the heart, and it was about the regular people. If it was about shapes and sizes, and it was about the most important things that are going on and the right look, then Saul would have never been blinded by a light from God. And definitely Saul, turned Paul, would have never made it through a background check in our children's ministry, let alone Rahab or Zacchaeus or Mary Magdalene. We have a tendency to overlook God's plan for people. When we organize the church and around professionals, we tend to do that looking for the right people for the right job all the time. And I've been as guilty as anybody in the past few months in the process of trying to start this new campus and looking for the gifted and the talented and the people who are sharp and inviting so people can be attracted to the church. Many times the church can be accused of crafting artificial environments based around people that really just aren't real. What if we chose an unsightly, homeless man in the beginning of a relationship with Jesus to be the centerpiece of our publicity, rather than a family with 2.5 kids, a dog, and a mother-in-law living with them? What if we did that instead? That's what Jesus would have done. Jesus picked the regular men. Jesus picked the regular people. And there's a genius in choosing all the wrong people, because all the wrong people have a much more inviting life for the Spirit of God to reside in them, to work in their lives. The Spirit of God rests on every disciple of Jesus, and we know that. But I love the way Platt puts it in his book, In Radical Together. If 11 disciples on a mountain in Galilee were enough to launch the gospel to the ends of the earth, then surely a church with a handful of members can spread the gospel beyond a community that we live in, regardless of the material resources we have. I think that's a beautiful picture. Our job as the church is to make disciples who continue on to make disciples. Our job is not to focus on the shell of the building that we worship in, not the shell of a building that we gather in, but the people who are inside of it. Our job is not to organize how and where and when our people minister, but our job is to focus on those things that God has already given us the opportunity to do. Where we live and where we play in our environments that we already exist in. We just have to open our eyes to it. Our job is not to identify all the all-stars in the field and place them in highly visible roles so people can be attracted to it. Our job, the goal of the church, is never for one person to be high profile, to lead as many people as possible to Christ. For one person to do that, our job is to equip all members to lead as many people as possible to Christ. At the end of the day, performance has nothing to do with it. People have everything to do with it. Even if it seems like all the wrong players.